Okay, are we ready? Are we live? Tim, are we live? Okay. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessing, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Okay. This is our first session of a series that we're entitling Orthodoxy in the Enchantment of the World. And I want to explain that title first because it's a strange title. It won't be obviously strange, but it's strange to me. The reason it's strange to me is that when I was working on this, I was thinking in my mind Orthodoxy and the re-enchantment of the world. And that's because it is broadly accepted, and this is one of the main theses of Charles Taylor, the philosopher whom we'll be talking about first in the first section of this series, that we live in a disenchanted world. And what's really interesting about this is to, first of all, break this word down, disenchantment. What does it mean that the world, the pre-modern world, the world before the modern age, and you've heard me say before, the modern age roughly begins around 1500. So around the time of the great revolutions of Western Europe and the Protestant Reformation, we call that modernity for a reason. And actually, we're going to see why very, very clearly in this class, hopefully in a way that will be very meaningful for us to make sense of the world we live in. But what does it mean to say that the pre-modern world was enchanted? What does it mean that modernity disenchanted the world such that we now live in a disenchanted world? And I'll give you concrete examples of this in a moment. And what would it mean to re-enchant the world? Well, from an Orthodox point of view, and this is the key to this class, I know in my descriptions of it, some of you might have rolled your eyes a little bit and said, oh, this sounds a little heavy and academic, and I'm not sure this would be at all interesting to me. I don't read philosophy. I'm not interested in that kind of thing. I promise you that's not this kind of course, because those aren't the kinds of thinkers that we're really working with. Charles Taylor wrote this magnificent book, I will hold up for you, A Secular Age, and I think it was published in 2010 or 2012, so it's fairly recently. It's been hugely influential. Charles Taylor is a professor of philosophy emeritus from McGill University. His latest book just came out. In fact, I believe it's part of a dual release. He wrote a book in 2018 called The Language Animal, which is interesting because the word enchantment, just break that down for a moment. Enchantment. It comes from a French root, enchantement, right? I don't know. I didn't study French, so someone can correct me there. But notice that word chant right in there. What does it mean that the world is enchanted? We say that and we already know what it means, right? The world is enchanted, so it's kind of magical, and there's unseen things in the world, and the world isn't just a material existence, a material universe with mathematical equations governing everything, and sort of this wind-up world that's self-contained and self-referential. There's meaning to the world beyond itself, and that's part of what we mean by enchantment. But the word is interesting because it's related to incantation. And we all know when we say incantation what we're talking about. That starts to sound like magic, right? And it is. But even incantation assumes that something is being spoken. So it's very interesting. Charles Taylor's his major follow-up to this work was The Language Animal, and it's about the way language shapes not only our perception of the world, but our ability to understand reality. And then the follow-up to that, the companion piece to that, was just released is called Cosmic Connections, Romantic Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment. Romantic referring not to romance between a man and a woman, but the romantic period of the poets that were reacting to the sterile, rational, cerebral world of the Enlightenment, finding magic, finding wonder and awe once again in the world, in their poetry. And so he breaks that down, what they're doing there. We're not going to talk about too much about all that because we will not have time. But A Secular Age is really his masterpiece. It's the thing that he's most known for. I'll be honest with you, it's a big book. It's a difficult book. It's very deep. But here's why it's important for us to be at least talking about it. We're not going to try to go through it chapter by chapter or section by section. That would be boring for you, right? That would be a college class or maybe a graduate school, graduate level class. The reason is that Charles Taylor's interest as a philosopher is not to write a history of other thinkers and what other people have said. In this book, he's largely writing as someone who's asking a fundamental question: what does it mean to live in a disenchanted world and still believe or not believe? What does it mean? What does it feel like to live in the world that we live in, and why does it feel that way? And those are very interesting questions because it means it's not dry and academic and sterile. He's really trying to get at the root of what it is like for us to live our lives. And in this sense, to say that the world is disenchanted is really not very controversial, and we'll see why in a moment. So obviously, if you feel like buying a book, it's a great book to have. There's all kinds of, this is just a tour de force. Absolutely worth reading, but also very difficult. So, by the way, there is a cheat sheet, if you will. There's a book that was written to explain that book called How Not to Be Secular. Okay, so this is essentially a reading guide. Also, though, I have to warn you, this is much more accessible, but it's still a very philosophical book. It's by James K.A. Smith, who's a professor at Reformed Seminary. He also is a philosopher. He's sort of emeritus professor of worldviews. All right, so one of the things that means is that for people getting master's degrees and above, you're thinking about how we understand the world and how we perceive reality in our epistemologies and all that. But what he does is he breaks the book down quite beautifully into its implications, particularly for how we as Christians think. Now, he's Reformed, and the thing is, a lot of the questions he's interested in would be interesting to a Reformed Protestant Christian. He's extremely thoughtful. He references a lot of literature, which I appreciate. I'll also be referencing some different literature, but this is good. And I'm actually going to be using this. I want to be put everything on the table to structure our approach to the bigger work. I will be using basically his way of drawing out the central themes of A Secular Age, but we're largely going to be relying on the big guy here in terms of what he actually says, and then thinking about it as Orthodox Christians, which we'll begin to do right now. So, enchantment captures this idea that when we sing or when we chant, we're creating a connection to an unseen realm. Okay? That's my definition of enchantment. You can look up a dictionary, but mostly enchantment definitions, even in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the gold standard of dictionaries, the OED really references it to be enchanted as to be magical and that sort of thing. But enchantment, which captures this root of the word chant in there, means that we sing, and our singing connects us to an unseen world. Okay? Now, what is the nature of that unseen world? That's what's really, really exciting, and I think without further ado, we'll go forward. I'm sort of reading through my notes here. Enchantment, incantation is associated with magic. It's associated with spells, the articulation of spells in particular. But chanting or singing in such a way that an invisible connection occurs, both for good or for evil. So an enchantment could be a curse, or an enchantment could be a blessing, but either way, it assumes that the visible world is overlapped with an invisible world. And that invisible world might be a very Christian invisible world and how we would understand it, but it also might be what we typically call a very pagan invisible world, filled with other things. And sometimes those two things themselves overlap, and we'll actually see examples of that in just a moment. But first, I want to define in Taylor's own words, what does he mean by that the world, the pre-modern world, before 1500, and by the way, Orthodoxy is pre-modern, so keep a bookmark on that, okay? The Orthodox Church never went through an Enlightenment, never went through the Renaissance, never radically changed things, and we'll see how important that is shortly. But before 1500, what does it mean to say that the world was enchanted? By that we mean the Middle Ages and all the way back to the beginning of time, to the beginning of humanity. The world was enchanted. So here's number one. The natural world they lived in, which had its place in the cosmos they imagined, I'll come back to that in a second, testified to divine purpose and action. Right? That's one meaning of what it is that the world is enchanted. The natural world testifies to divine purpose and action. And not just in the obvious way, which we can still understand, and at least many of us appreciate today, that its order and design bespeaks creation, right? That's, okay, people have believed that all the way up through the present day, even if the world isn't disenchanted, but especially in the Middle Ages and before, because the great events in this natural order, storms, droughts, floods, plagues, as well as years of exceptional fertility and flourishing, were seen as acts of God, as the now dead metaphor of our legal language still bears witness, right? So what is he referring to there? There is still a legal code in which something is described legally as an act of God, usually an accident of some immense source or power that nobody could have reasonably foreseen and be civilly liable for, okay? You can't be civilly liable for an act of God. But where does that come from? It comes from a time where we assumed that all the great forces working in our lives were in fact acts of God, that they were the active working out of God's providence, his care for his creation, or his punishment and his wrath. So an enchanted world is a world in which there is divine purpose and action in everything, not just when you come to church, but when you are out there, when you are in your work, when you are on the farmstead, where you are making shoes, whatever you're doing in the world, it is a world filled with God. It is a world filled, therefore, with other spiritual agents. It's an unseen world, right? And the physical, visible things of this world speak to the presence of unseen things. That's very important. So that's what it means that the world is enchanted. And here I'll start with a controversial thing, just to make sure no one's falling asleep yet. In an enchanted world, when a plague like COVID hit, okay, just imagine COVID hits in 1392 for some reason. How does the person of an enchanted world handle COVID? Well, the first thing they're going to think is, God is punishing us. God is punishing us. If they are closing the church, or if most people can't go to church, God is telling us something that we need to repent and make sure that we go to church more when it's open. If we have to stand 6 feet apart and isolate, it's because this horrible thing, we're not treating each other correctly. We're not engaging our society correctly. We better repent of this. If it's isolate and be away from everybody, same thing. We've been too isolated. We need to reapproach our social life. We need to re-engage the presence of God in our midst. In other words, the first assumption is, what is God telling me with COVID to a person living in an enchanted world? Instead, in our time, in a disenchanted world, our minds went elsewhere, didn't they? We wanted to blame the Chinese, and we wanted to blame Fauci, and we wanted to blame the government, and first it was this administration, and that was an administration, and masks, don't get us started on masks, what a waste of time. But we didn't think, what does it mean that we're masking ourselves and we can't see each other face to face? And what does that say theologically? And what is God telling me about my own repentance? Even though we can say, look, COVID's a global thing, and we're not talking about my sin caused it, nevertheless, the way that people in an enchanted age would experience any kind of plague is that this is the hand of God, and he's telling us something. This isn't something that we have to then lash out at each other. Okay? All right. I know I'm probably stepping on some toes there. Maybe there's enough distance that we can start to get philosophical about COVID, I hope. But, and maybe that's a bad idea. Obviously, the Black Plague is a different case in Western Europe. But you get the idea that if we live in an enchanted world and we really inhabit it, it changes the way we understand acts of God, right? Okay, number 2, God was implicated in the very existence of society. A kingdom could only be conceived as grounded in something higher than mere human action in secular time. And beyond that, the life of various associations which made up society, parishes, boroughs, guilds, and so on, were interwoven with worship and ritual. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, I'm just quoting him here, one could not but encounter God everywhere. So an enchanted world and a pre-secular world, and we're going to define what that means soon, is a world where you find God everywhere. You can't go anywhere and not see God, find God, see that a world of spirits is at work. I mentioned I wanted to put a bookmark on the word cosmos, and this is another important aspect of enchantment. We tend to think of the world, the bigger world, as a universe. And a universe is not the same thing as what the ancients meant by the cosmos. The cosmos was the ordered world of creation filled with a hierarchy of being and values, and which the varying levels of the cosmos revealed and spoke to the other levels of the cosmos, okay? So the cosmos was very much part of an enchanted world where everything had meaning, everything had purpose, everything found its end in the person of God. That's a cosmos. And here's a great example of that that I think is important for us not to misunderstand. Have you ever heard this, that in the ancient world, people looked up in the sky at the stars, and they said, oh, the stars are angels, right? The stars are angelic beings. And now that we live in an enchanted world, a disenchanted world, we say, oh, how silly, right? Stars are not angelic beings. Stars are gas giants that are billions and trillions of miles off into the deep darkness of space. And we're only seeing the light that reaches us after traveling for trillions of years to get our billions of years to get here. And that's what the stars are. And so those poor pre-modern ancients, they were pretty silly and gullible, weren't they? They looked up and they saw stars. They looked up and they saw angels. Well, here's the thing. That is not what the cosmos meant to the ancient people. I'm going to challenge that narrative, that when they said that stars were angels, that it was just simply a very, very superficial, naive, oh yeah, there's a light in the sky, that must be an angelic being. The ancient people had experiences of angels all the time. They had iconography of angels. They knew that angels looked like this with the wings, right, covering them. They knew that the angels were dynamic presences, that they weren't just static or slowly moving lights in the sky. In other words, for them, it's not that the light itself was an angel. It's that the light spoke to a meaning in creation itself, a cosmic meaning, and that the movement of the stars, sometimes called astrology, if we study it, right? The movement of the stars could foretell the future, or it could give you your fortune, or this is what this month is going to bring you. But the thing is, we have stories in which God is using the stars to bring about the salvation of humankind. What's a great example of that? Christmas, yes. And the Magi, get that? In an enchanted world, a Magi is what? A magician, somehow maybe a king, a wise man, someone who probably worships, a priest who chants, is looking up in the sky and sees that a star is revealing that the Messiah of Israel has been born, right? All of that is captured in an enchanted world view. And it doesn't mean necessarily that in the case of the Magi, I have argued this before. I think that the most important way of understanding that is that they were indeed being led by an angelic light to where Christ was, which is why Herod couldn't find it, and the other people in Jerusalem couldn't find Bethlehem. They didn't know how to follow that star, right? That's part of the story. If it was just a star, it would be something else. But they're seeing meaning and purpose. And so it's not just necessarily that they have a simplistic view of reality. It's that they view reality as bespeaking the presence of the divine and the working out of God's plan, okay? So there's a cosmos. Universe, different. In the universe, it's all Planck's laws and Higgs particles and, you know, everything in physics that we now have, where we're trying to understand the great unfathomable mystery of the material creation, but with the assumption that the material creation is all there is. And that's a different way of looking at reality. So we'll come back to that, of course. So in this number 2, though, we encounter God everywhere, and he's involved in everything. And this means politics. One of the easiest anachronisms, I know we've talked about this before, is for us to read back our experience of politics back into the ancient time and think that a king is just a king. That means he's a person of power and military, and that's it. And what he's saying is what I have said before. No, kings had a sacerdotal role. They had a sacred function. Another example of this that I think we misunderstand in the disenchanted world is when we talk about the divine right of kings. Everyone remember that from school, the divine right of kings, and the overthrowing of the divine right of kings was essential in the establishment of our nation, our Enlightenment nation, right? Which is very disenchanted in this. The idea was that the kings would claim divine warrant for doing whatever it is that they wanted. But the divine order, the divine right of kings is actually in an enchanted world much more important than that, much more subtle. It meant that the king had a role in maintaining the order of the cosmos, an order of the universe. So we find God everywhere in an enchanted world, and what we'll find in the second definition of the secular is we begin to find whole areas of life where God is nowhere to be found, right? Okay. So number 3, people lived in an enchanted world, perhaps not the best expression. It seems to invoke light and fairies. But what he's invoking here is its negation. Weber's expression, disenchantment, as a description of our modern condition. This term has achieved such wide currency in our discussion of these matters that I'm going to use its antonym to describe a crucial feature of the pre-modern condition. The enchanted world in this sense is the world of spirits, demons, and moral forces which our ancestors lived in, right? So I would say from an Orthodox point of view, if we didn't like the word enchanted because of its connotation with magic and spells, we could easily simply call it the sacred world or the sacramental world. If we understand by that the whole world is sacred, the whole world is sacramental, the whole world is the meeting place between us and God. We don't have some parts of the world that we meet God in and other parts of the world that we just tend to our business. That's the disenchanted world, all right? That's the desacralized world. That's the non-sacramental world, which is really a direct consequence of the Protestant Reformation itself, which is going to reject the sacramental view of the world. So is everyone tracking me with that the enchanted world is the world of spirits, demons, and moral forces which our ancestors lived in? And we're going to see then in this course that this changes over time. Any questions? Everyone with me so far? Is this pretty straightforward? Okay, I want to give an example because it's just too perfect to not give an example. This is a scene from Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset, the great Nobel Prize-winning Norwegian masterpiece. If you've never read it, I really highly recommend it. One of the great things is this is always makes the list of long books that you should read. Think about in the winter when you could be watching Netflix, you could be reading Kristin Lavransdatter instead, and it's really, really thrilling. The neat thing about this book actually is it's set in the 1300s in Norway, which is obviously in the pre-modern medieval era, And what's fascinating is that it's in Norway, and it's a very Roman Catholic world, but it is indistinguishable in many ways from what we would describe as the Orthodox world. This was still the time that they fasted, the Western Christians fasted like we did, and it's very much an enchanted world. So I want to share a particularly poignant example of what an enchanted world looks like and what it means, what does it feel like to live in an enchanted world. So here's the setup. Kristen has been allowed to go with her father and some other men on a trip into the sort of high country of Norway. So they left their farmstead, their estate, their sort of landed gentry. She's only about 8 years old, so she's a young girl. And they go up into the hills, and it's a beautiful day, and everyone has decided to take a nap. And so she falls asleep, and then suddenly wakes up in this field, and all the men are snoring around her, and her father is right there, and he's snoring. And she sees her horse, and her horse has a name. The horse isn't just a pack animal. It's a very personal creature to her. And she decides to get up, and the horse begins to go down towards a stream where there's like a pond area. And so Kristen follows her horse down there, and she begins to notice that the water is like glass, and you can see reflections in it. And it's really important. This is really exciting for her because normally people in this age would hardly ever see their reflection. They would never have a clear mirror in which to see what they looked like. So she wants to look into the water, all right? And this should be like, if you're reading literature, this should already be piquing your interest. Like Narcissus, right? This desire to gaze deeply into the deeps to see yourself, but what are you going to see instead? And so she begins to do that, and she notices the flowers are beautiful, so she picks some flowers and she puts them in her hair, and she's doing these things to make herself look beautiful. And then I'm going to read now. She bent over the water and saw her own dark image rise up from the depths and become clearer as it became closer. Then she saw in the mirror of the stream that someone was standing among the birches on the other side and leaning toward her. Abruptly, she straightened up into a kneeling position and looked across the water. At first, she thought she saw only the rock face and the trees clustered at its base, but suddenly she discerned a face among the leaves. There was a woman over there with a pale face and flowing flaxen hair. Her big light gray eyes and her flaring pale pink nostrils reminded Kristen of Goldsvine's. Goldvine is her horse. Okay? She was wearing something shiny and leaf green, and branches and twigs hid her figure up to her full breasts, which were covered with brooches and gleaming necklaces. Kristen stared at the vision. Then the woman raised her hand and showed her a wreath of golden flowers and beckoned to her with it. Behind her, Kristen heard Goldsvine, the horse, whinny loudly with fear. She turned her head. The stallion reared up, gave a resounding shriek, and then whirled around and set off up the hillside, making the ground thunder. The other horses followed. They rushed straight up the scree so that rocks plummeted down with a crash and branches and roots snapped and cracked. Then Kristen screamed as loud as she could. "Father," she shrieked. "Father!" She sprang to her feet and ran up the slope after the horses, not daring to look back over her shoulder. She clambered up the scree, tripped on the hem of her dress, and slid down, then climbed up again, scrabbling onward with bleeding hands, crawling on scraped and bruised knees. This might be like hunting antelope in Wyoming a little bit. Calling to Goldsvine in between her shouts to her father while the sweat poured out of her whole body, running like water into her eyes, and her heart pounded as if it would hammer a hole through her chest. Sobs of terror rose in her throat. "Oh, Father, Father!" Then she heard his voice somewhere above her, and her father comes down and sees her. The first thing he says was, "Sancta Maria," right, Saint Mary. Lavrin, as her father, knelt down next to his daughter and pulled her to him. He was pale, and there was a strange look to his mouth that frightened Kristen even more. Not until she saw his face did she realize the extent of her peril. "Child, child," he lifted up her bloody hands, looked at them, noticed the wreath on her bare head, and touched it. "What's this? How did you get here, little Kristen?" And so she begins to say, "I followed the horse. I went down. Someone waved to me from down by the stream." "Who waved? Was it a man?" No, it was a woman. She beckoned to me with a wreath of gold. I think it was a dwarf maiden, Father. I think it was a dwarf maiden. Jesus Christus, said Lavrens softly, making the sign of the cross over the child and himself. So notice the first thing he does. She thinks she's seen a dwarf maiden, so he signs her with the sign of the cross. He helped her up the slope until they came to the grassy hillside. Then he lifted her up and carried her. She clung to his neck. Soon they reached the other men, who clasped her hands together and Istrid, who clasped her hands together when she heard what had happened. And so they begin to hear the story, and they say, oh, that must have been the elf maiden, not the dwarf maiden, but the elf maiden. I tell you, she must have wanted to lure this pretty child into the mountains. Be quiet, said Lavrens harshly. We shouldn't have talked about such things the way we did here in the forest. You never know who's under the stones listening to every word. You never know who's under the stones, right? So again, this is an enchanted world. What's that? Alexa, yeah. Well, that's really great, because I think that since even a secular age has been written and we've talked about disenchantment, technology is seeking to re-enchant the world. And that's why I chose the word that I did. This is orthodoxy in the enchantment of the world, not the re-enchantment. Because I do think that the magic of the world that technology is trying to emulate that, but in a false way. And that will be the connection, by the way, to mental health later on. This is why we're suffering. We've allowed bad magic into our lives. But that's part of the narrative of how we get there. So notice, though, what's happening here. No one says, oh, little girl, you're so silly. It wasn't a dwarf maiden. It wasn't an elf maiden. They're frightened even to speak of these things because they don't know what spiritual powers might be nearby listening. And they really believe that they're in danger. Then, however, he pulled out the golden chain with the reliquary cross from inside his shirt and hung it around Kristen's neck, placing it against her bare skin. All of you must guard your tongues well, he told them. And he's worried about her mother finding out what happened. Of course, men are always worried about when they feel that they've endangered their daughters. The mother can never know. But this is an example, a great example of the enchanted world. One is that she thinks she saw a dwarf maiden. She's corrected, no, it was an elf maiden. It was definitely something, and it was definitely a spiritual thing, and it wanted to lure her into the woods, probably to kill her or to eat her. And the solution was to sign her with the sign of the cross and place a relic around her to protect her from evil forces, okay? Those are the key elements of an enchanted world where it is both Christian and pagan. What do I mean by that? When we open the scriptures, almost any page of the Bible you can open up to and find that the Bible assumes that we live in an enchanted world, or a sacramental world, or a sacred world is probably better, right? That there are invisible forces everywhere, that there is spiritual forces everywhere. Jesus goes out into the desert, Judean desert, after he's baptized, and what does he encounter there? But the enemy, right? Satan tempts him. And the wilderness is where spiritual evil lives. And the scripture just takes that as an absolute given, all right? Same thing. Where does the elf maiden live? Deep into the woods and the mountains. So you have to be careful, and you dare not speak of evil things lightly, otherwise evil things manifest themselves to you. Which, by the way, there's lots of examples of people who have opened themselves up. I'll mention this again later, but who have opened themselves up to obvious spiritual evil and either engaging in satanic worship or the occult. I'm not talking about dabbling at like Harry Potter witchcraft and that sort of thing, little things where it's just, it's make-believe. There are people that actively seek out dark spiritual forces to worship them or to open themselves to them. And those people sometimes are the ones who are the clearest advocates for saying that the world is not simply material and dense through and through, that there are dark spiritual forces at work. Anyone who thinks that the demons or the devil aren't real, just talk to someone who has gotten out of Satanism and some of the horrific things that they've experienced and witnessed is part of this terror of seeing a spiritual personage like Kristen seeing this dwarf or elf maiden and then running like crazy and having a sense of being in very great danger. All right, so that's an example of the enchanted world. And I want to be clear, what are the questions that, here's the central questions that Charles Taylor is asking. Why was it virtually impossible not to believe in God in, say, 1500 in our Western society, while in 2000 many of us find this not only easy, but inescapable? Why was it impossible to believe in God in the Enchanted Age in 1500? And why is it changed now? And how did it change? And what are the conditions of believing? Why does it feel like this? Another question he asks, how do we move from a condition where in Christendom people lived naively within a theistic construal to one in which we shall all shunt between two stances, in which everyone's construal shows up as such, and in which, moreover, unbelief has become, for many, the default option? Okay? So these are the questions. What happened to our perception of the world? And is the disenchanted world simply the way the world actually is? Or is it that we have changed in terms of our ability to see what is real and what is not real, both the seen and the unseen? And I'll point out John chapter 3, Jesus' discussion of this with Nicodemus, when he says, he's talking to him about the movement of the Spirit, and he says very specifically, if I tell you of physical things and you cannot believe, or earthly things, I think is the word he used. If I tell you of earthly things and you do not believe them, how will you believe me when I tell you of heavenly things? Right? In other words, one of the big underlying threads of the gospel narrative is that here God himself is walking amongst his people and the people don't see him as such. So something has happened to them, even in their still very much enchanted world. Okay. Let me talk a little bit here about the three forms of the secular that are important to understanding what Charles Taylor is after so that we know what we're talking about. The first thing is that the word secular comes from the Latin word saeculum, and saeculum refers to an age or roughly a length of time roughly equal to one human lifetime. All right, that's the origin of the word, a secular thing. A seculum, or the seculum, is a time or an age roughly equivalent to one human lifespan. And in its first use, it was first used in the enchanted world, what we're calling the enchanted world. So it wasn't that it was invented later on as an alternative to faith or belief. That would be a misconstrual. It was used, but in its original use in the enchanted world, secular things originally would refer to matters pertaining to this world in its immediacy. So in other words, there's a distinction between a monk who devotes their life to sort of leaving the world and focusing entirely on eternity. And in some ways, this is a Western definition because our Orthodox monasticism is very different than Western monasticism at almost all stages. But Western monastics, especially in Western Europe, when they left the world, they really attended only to the eternal things, the eschatological things. But other people woke up and baked the bread that they would sell in the town square to make a few pence, to buy other food. And they lived their life attending to the immediate physical needs of life. Okay? So secular, the first use of the term secular refers to this distinction between those who pursue a purely sacred vocation and those who pursue a vocation that attends to the needs of this life. All right? There's a lot to unpack there, and I don't want to get bogged down into it, but one of the things that will lead in the Reformation in the West to the complete rejection of monasticism is the fact that monastics really did just pray and study, and they relied on the peasants tied to their lands to do all the food, all the clothing, all the mending, all the physical labor. All of that was done by peasantry, okay? So there really was a very sharp divide, and this becomes part of our story later. The reason I mention that is that Orthodox monasticism has never really functioned that way. Orthodox monks work. They work really hard. They might be up all night praying, but they're only going to get like 3 hours of sleep, and then they're going to work in the fields, and they're going to make clothes, and they're going to make shoes and vestments, and they're going to do things to earn a living. Even hermits work to earn a living in the Orthodox tradition. So it's a little bit different dynamic, but that dynamic for our purposes was very much a part of the Western world. Another example of this is that we use the term secular clergy, and you'll see this even in Orthodox documents, the secular clergy. The secular clergy, what is that? Well, not the monastic clergy. So monastic clergy are hieromonks, priest monks. The secular clergy are in the parish where their people, their flock, is attending to the sort of daily aspects of life. But it's really important, I think, and we'll move on from this, but it's really important for us to understand that we don't understand this use of the word secular because it implies the enchanted world being around us. And it meant that while you can make a distinction between purely sacred work and work that had to do with meeting our immediate physical needs, but that does not at all mean that people went to work thinking, oh, I'm just at work and God has nothing to do with it, all right? That's not part of the enchanted age. Remember, we define the enchanted age where you meet God everywhere. So whether you're a bread baker or most peasants, of course, were farmers, you were very much tied in to a spiritual world in your farming, to a liturgical world, to a ritual rhythm of life, to prayer while you worked to some degree, to measuring the seasons and the feasts. Everything was still shot through with the sacred. It's just that you were doing something obviously, like if you're digging out potatoes, it's to feed, people, whereas the monk is just praying for the sake of the world. So that's the original use of the term secular. The second use is the one that will be most familiar to us, and that is the world as a secular world. In modernity, after the Enlightenment, secular begins to refer to what we call non-sectarian or neutral or a-religious spaces or standpoints, meaning you have parts of the world that you inhabit in which God is not found. Okay? That's secular too, the second definition of secular. And it's a great example. This is an American public school, right? In an American public school, God is not allowed, right? You can't talk about God. You can't teach about God. There's no school prayer. You might have a private club. You might have a Christian club, but you also probably have an Islamic club, and you might even have a Satanist club. In fact, there was a controversy about this fairly recently in the news, where I think a student wanted to form a Satanist society or Satanist club in the school, and they didn't want to let him do it, but then how do you do that? How do you not let him do it, but let Christians and Jews and Muslims have their religious groups within a public school? But the idea is that this is now a tense question. Are you allowed to acknowledge the existence of God in these spaces? Usually you're not, or it has to be very, very controlled. It's a way, the secular II world is a way of carving out public spaces in which no reference to God or spiritual things or the enchanted world is necessary or even desired. Okay? So most of us in school, in work, in maybe our neighborhoods, this is now a secular world, and it's a disenchanted world. Okay, that's essentially what that means. Does that make sense to everybody? Is that clear? Faith in a secular II world, faith is a private matter. Faith is a private matter. That was never true in the pre-modern enchanted world. Faith was not a private matter, and that's one of the things that's so hard for us to grasp. But now faith is a private matter and unnecessary to temporal well-being in terms of our collective identity. The third version of secular is what Taylor really defines as being most important to his question, and that is secular 3 refers to conditions of belief. no matter what we believe, we might, as Orthodox Christians, come here 3 or 4 times a week and we pray and we have a rule of prayer and we believe that there are indeed angels and spirits in the world, etc., etc. But we still believe those things under different conditions than did people living in the Enchanted Age. And this is crucial. Even if we believe very strongly, we are still aware of the possibility of unbelief. We're still aware of our siblings or our children or our uncles or aunts or neighbors who don't believe and who don't go to church. We know that our belief might be strong, our faith might be strong, but it is optional in our society, in our world. And that is a different condition of belief than the way people believed in the age of enchantment, which, again, is everything before the modern age. Taylor describes it as a zigzag. It's not a clear line. It moves in phases and retracts, and there's reactions and that sort of thing. But unbelief was impossible, all right? So even our idea of personal faith, of individual faith, has been shaped by a secular world, has been shaped by the disenchantment of the world. And so that means we believe differently than did people in 1200, for instance, okay? And that is, of course, even true of Orthodox Christians. Because the world we live in, inhabit, and work in, and go to school in is so secularized, it has changed the conditions of belief. And it is, in some ways, I've learned a lot. I'm still learning a lot by wrestling with this material, but it really challenges our ideas of what it means to have collective faith, of what it means to have individual faith or personal faith, of how do we balance our faith with our work and our place in a larger society that is completely decided that God is not necessary and that the only thing we need is, and fill in the blank, whatever political persuasion you have. Most people believe that the temporal world, the most important thing is that the right people are in charge of our politics, right? But ancient people didn't think that way. Medieval people didn't think that way. It was that the king worshiped God correctly. God ensured the well-being and well-ordering of society in a cosmos. We kind of assume that, no, the government does that. And it's a totally different way of thinking, a totally different world. I know it's getting late, so I don't, is everyone doing okay? Can we go a few more minutes? One of the questions, 8:25. So we've been going about, 40 minutes, something like that? One of the things to think of in terms of secularism is exclusive humanism as a viable social imaginary. It became a viable thing for our society to assume that all we need was human reason. All we need is human power and strength in order to make the world work to our liking. All right, the only thing we really need to understand those balls of gas that are 2,800 billion miles away is this guy right here. That's humanism, right? And we have a confidence that humanism, exclusive humanism, is enough. That we can do it, that we can understand the world just by using math, just by understanding the way that it works, just by using our brain. Again, this is part of the story of ancient people, medieval people did not think that way. That is not the way they thought of reality. And again, our temptation in especially the secular II age is to think of secular II, this humanism as a viable social imaginary, as simply the way things are. If I don't see elf maidens, then there are not elf maidens, right? That is mythology. That is fairy tales. That means what else isn't true? What else isn't real, right? What about angels, and what about demons, and what about all the stories in the New Testament? Interestingly, when we come in, and I think this is important, but when we come into an Orthodox church, it's really powerful to realize that the way an Orthodox church is on the inside and on the outside is exactly the way Orthodox churches have been from the pre-modern era all the way through to the present day. meaning that one of the astonishing gifts that we have as Orthodox Christians is we come in here and we experience church the same way we could have in the 10th century, the same way we could have in the 5th century. We come in and what do we see in the iconography and the murals? When we were in Georgia, this is what we saw in 5th, 6th century churches. This is how they were built, right? And it's a world that says the icons are a revelation, a sign to us that the saints are present here, that they are invisibly overlapping. And because this space is sacred, because it is set apart for the worship of God, we come in and we see an enchanted world. We see a sacred world. And here's where enchanted may be even the most powerful thing, because we are indeed chanting in here, and we are singing. And the chanting and the singing evokes or creates a connection for us, between us who are in the physical world to the invisible world. But everything about the space invokes this sense of an invisible presence. And notice that we even have what originally appears to be like pagan ideas, right? On the Horos, there's a unicorn, okay? So think of the Kristen Lavransdatter dwarf maiden, right? Elf maiden. The Bible doesn't talk about dwarves and elves, right? But here we are. There's a unicorn. There's I guess that's an eagle. It could be a griffin. But there's a dragon. Dragons, of course, are very interesting. We have a dragon over there with St. George. Interestingly, one of the things we noticed, the country of Georgia is named after St. George, right? And the earliest icons of St. George don't have dragons, don't have a dragon. Does anyone know what they have? What's in the icon? Diocletian, the emperor. The first icons, the earliest icons we have of St. George is that he's on his horse and Diocletian is bound as the emperor of the Roman Empire. He's bound and sitting on the ground, lying on the ground, and it demonstrates that St. George has overcome Diocletian. This is really fascinating. The next level, and you can see this in Georgian churches, when you get to a church that's a little bit older now, suddenly the dragon appears. But he isn't stabbing it with a spear. Instead, the dragon is being led on a lead. So you have St. George on his stallion, and then he has a servant behind him, and the servant is holding like a horse lead, a leash basically, but not like a dog leash. I don't think they would have thought that way back then. But he's got a dragon on a lead, like a horse, and the dragon has clearly been tamed. He's been subdued. St. George has overcome the dragon, and now the dragon is no longer dangerous. And then you get to the 1400s, the 1500s, those churches, and now St. George is spearing the dragon, right? So a more militant idea of the dragon emerges, and now he's slaying it. But of course, in all of these, it really is a reference to Satan. That's what Diocletian means. Diocletian is the image of the Roman Empire as the Antichrist, persecuting Christians, but St. George has overcome him. And then the evolution of that icon, the dragon, evokes back the serpent in the garden, which was never merely a snake, as we would understand a snake from a naturalist, disenchanted way of thinking. It was the dragon, it was the great serpent, and that's who we see as well in the book of Revelation. So in all of those, St. George is overcoming. But we have these things. We have a unicorn. We have dragons. In the icon of theophany, and really in references to the blessing of waters and baptism, we have spirits in the water. We talk about that, right? You're gazing deep into the water. You want to see your reflection, but look out. There's things in there. What are they? I've seen some icons of theophany where there's really, I guess you would call them fairies. They're like demonic little creatures that are inhabiting the water. We speak at funerals of the spirits of the air, meaning in the air there are evil spirits, and when the soul parts from the body, it passes through those evil spirits. So again, this is all part of the enchanted world, and this is all part of what we call a social imaginary for us. This is, for us, the way the world is. But exclusive humanism has, for most people out there, supplanted any idea of the enchanted world. All we need is human reason, human power. The world itself is flat. It is unenchanted. It is not magical. Anywhere there is magic, it's just a trick, right? It's just a sleight of hand. It's just an illusion, or it's just a fable or a myth, or something we tell to console each other or to help children. Here's a great example of this as well. And it's my own experience with a witch in the woods. I was probably 10 years old, and I was with a friend, or it might have been my cousin, and we lived in a town where it was surrounded by woods, and you could go down the woods, down this big hill, and cross this waterfall onto the railroad tracks, and it was lots of places to explore. And a friend and I were down there. We're pretty young, like we hadn't wandered this far before ever in our lives. And we went way up the railroad tracks, and all we can see around us is woods. We really can't see what's beyond the next sort of hill. And all of a sudden we hear in the distance in the woods this witch cackle. Right? And we both stop and we look at each other, and we are both like collecting things from the railroad tracks, and we drop them and we just run like crazy all the way home. And I get in and I'm telling my mom, oh my goodness, we were on the railroad tracks and it was woods and we heard a witch. There was a witch in the woods and she laughed at us. All right? Right? Obviously it wasn't a witch. It was just some kid having fun, probably laughing at us, because we had wandered far enough that the next town over those houses of the next town over began to be present over the hill. And we didn't know that. We were children, right? We didn't see, okay? So we start to rethink what things mean. If you hear cackling in the woods, it's not really a witch. It's just someone else having fun at your expense. This is part of the exclusive humanism that we have to deal with. So I think that's enough for tonight. It's 8:34. We will come back then and talk about 5 basic things that had to change for the enchanted world to become a disenchanted world. For the elf maiden of Kristen Lavransdatter that was taken deadly seriously to the teenager cackling in the woods at me, and it was obviously not a witch, but I thought it was a witch, until I realized once I was home, well, boy, I was being stupid, wasn't I? All right? There's a whole world of transformation between those two things. So we'll talk about that next week. All right? Thank you.